Oscar, welcome to the Guild of Dads podcast.
G'day, Joe. Looking forward to listening to your questions.
Yeah, likewise. I got hold of a copy of your book, Deep Listening, a little while back. And first and foremost, I love the fact that it's really small and it's concise and it's easy to follow and it's clear. And that was kind of a breath of fresh air to me, because some of the books that cover difficult topics are often kind of quite long and cumbersome. But I just wondered, sort of kind of straight off the bat, why we struggle to listen so deeply, or deeply as we should do, in 2020.
It's not unique to 2020, Joe. It's the neuroscience tells us we speak at 125 words a minute, and we can listen at up to 400 words a minute. So we're programmed to fill in the gaps for the other 275 words. We're distracted. We're distracted by the story that the speaker's telling. We're distracted by the story in our own head. We're distracted by devices. We have many distractions, internal and external. But the most important thing is to know you're going to be distracted. And the difference between a distracted listener and a deep listener isn't that they're going to be much better at listening, is they will notice much more quickly when they're distracted. In fact, while you're listening right now, you're probably distracted yourself. You're drifting away. You're thinking about lunch, or what you should have had for breakfast, or what you might want to make for dinner, or what you've got to prepare for something coming up on the weekend. So it's happening for you right now. So the opportunity in 2020 to be distracted, Joe, just as big as the opportunity in 1920 or 1820. And it's our mind. Our mind, like our vision is peripheral vision, and our ears have peripheral hearing. So we're always listening out for other things that might keep us alive or might take our life. So just know the 125-400 rule, Joe, and that's the simplest way to think about listening in a really different way.
Mm-hmm. And from that rule, is the trick to kind of slow down one or the other? Is it a trick to kind of slow down your thoughts to the speed of kind of what you're speaking at, or are there kind of tactics that you can use to try and level that balance a little bit?
Well, the first thing is just know you're going to be distracted. Anticipate the fact that the speaker's story right now is going to create a conversation in your head about, oh, when was the last time that happened for me? Or that's never happened to me. Oh, that reminds me of a vacation I went on. Oh, that reminds me of a school teacher I had. So the tips, they're pretty simple. And one, whenever you got external distractions, the most common external distraction are going to be electronic. And the most common electronic distraction is going to be your mobile phone. So tip number one, switch your mobile phone into flight mode. It's the fact that you've switched it into flight mode, you can relax because you're not going to get any messages. Some people go, well, I'll switch it to silent, but they anticipate, oh, there's a message I'm expecting from Mary about the party this weekend, and, it's really important that I figure out how many people I need to cater for. And while you're doing that, you're not paying attention to the conversation right in front of you. So tip number one, try and remove those external electronic distractions. 86% of people struggle with distractions, and 52% of people struggle most with electronic distractions. Eventually you can switch that mobile phone off, but for a lot of people that's a bridge too far. Going into silent mode is the first step, going into flight mode is the next step, and switching it off. Tip number two, drink water. A hydrated brain is a listening brain. And listening happens in the most modern part of the brain, the bit just behind the skull. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And the brain, 5% of body mass, Joe, but it consumes 26% of blood sugars. So a disproportionate amount of energy is required when you're doing this very complex task called listening. And listening is relatively modern in the human brain compared to other things that we do. So it's not something we got taught at school, so we don't have any mental shortcuts in how to do it well. So tip number two, drink a glass of water every half an hour. You should be drinking between 2 and 3 litres of water every day. And tip number three, just take a deep breath. It's that simple. In through your nose, down to the bottom of your lungs, and out through your mouth. It's not a yoga pose. It's not a weightlifter's pose. In terms of weightlifters breathing, or a yoga person breathing, it's just a simple breath. And the breath is a really good way to say to the nervous system in the body, hey, relax. We got this. Just pay attention. And for a lot of us, I would say that's the fourth thing to think about. There's 3 tips, but do you pay attention or do you give attention? So when you're in a dialogue with somebody, you're paying attention or giving attention. Paying attention feels like taxation. You're obliged to do it. Whereas giving attention feels like it's a gift. It's something that's heartfelt. It's something that you want to do. So notice that when you show up. But most listening, Joe, happens before you turn up to the conversation. If you're distracted, if you're frantic, if you're thinking about something else, you've got too many browser tabs open in your head, listening's unlikely to take place in a quality way. So they're the simplest tips: is devices off, drink water, take a deep breath when you know you're distracted.
And in terms of the devices, what effects is that having on your ability to concentrate? I mean, there is the obvious that there may be a noise, or there may be an expectation that something is going to buzz, or it's going to hum, or it's going to make a noise, like you said. But I was reading Cal Newport's book Deep Work recently, and he talks about the actual effects that it has. There's like a carryover effect, if you like, that it has sometime after the event of actually checking it, that affects not only the ability to carry out deep work, but I would imagine has a psychological effect on your ability to listen as well.
Yeah, and Cal's done a great deal here to highlight this in the context of deep work, but even in the context of any work. There's a residual impact on working memory. I've interviewed a couple of neuroscientists, a couple of professors of attention, and spoken to them about what's going on in the brain. What people say, well, I can multitask. You can multitask on robotic tasks such as driving a car. This is true, which means you can look in the rear vision mirror, you can move the wheel, you can move your feet. But that isn't a cognitively complex task. It's relatively robotic once you learn the task the first time, unlike listening, which is something that requires consciousness, it needs concentration, it needs collaboration. It means there's always 2 people in the dialogue. So for all of us, we need to understand this really simple thing. Software designers are using the same psychologists that keep up on the slot machines in Las Vegas. They want to get you into a mental state that continues to scroll unconsciously through a bunch of stuff and pay attention to red dots. And mobile devices aren't inherently bad, but if the devices are using you instead of you using them, that's when it becomes bad. And when we talk to the professors about working memory, there is a residual effect. You only have a finite amount of working memory that can be focused on that task at hand. And there is a switching cost coming out of or into a task that's complex. And a lot of people won't think of listening as a complex task. They'll think about math as a complex task. And yet they've been taught how to do math at school. And yet when it comes to listening, they have no concept of what good or bad listening is. They've never been taught it. They don't have a framework. They don't have any models or heuristics to work with as well. So, for a lot of us, we're not even conscious of the cost of not listening. I remember this story about Mick. He rang me up on a Monday morning and he said, Oscar, you nearly cost me my marriage last Friday night. And I was like, oh, okay, tell me more. And I was in a car and he was in a car, and we were both driving and commuting to work on that Monday morning. I remember it was 8:16. I can still picture the clock on the car. And he said, my wife on Friday night had put the kids to bed. I'd cleaned up the dinner table. And she said those magic words you never want to hear. I said, "Oh, what words are those, Mick?" And he said, "We need to talk." And as I sat down, I knew something was coming. And she said to me, "I just want you to be honest. I know you're having an affair. Just tell me who it is so we can move on." And in his head, he's exploding because he said, "I'm not having an affair. Where's this coming from?" But I remember what Oscar taught me. And he just said, "Oh, tell me more." And she said, "For the last 90 days, you've been paying me so much more attention than you have at any other time in our 12-year marriage. I know you're having an affair." And he burst out laughing, and she burst out crying because she felt he wasn't taking her seriously. And he said, "Look, it's not what you think it is. I've been spending the last 90 days with a man." And she continued to cry because she jumped to an assumption. And he said, no, this guy's teaching me how to listen. And she said, "Well, that explains everything. I've never felt sexier than I have in the last 90 days. For the whole of our marriage, you've been paying me so much more attention." And I think in that story, and the balance of the story is X-rated. He talked about a better night than his honeymoon and all this kind of stuff, but we'll leave that out. And in that story captures both the cost of not listening and how people feel when they are listened to. And for a lot of us, we just don't even get into conversations because we've got our head in a computer, an iPad, a mobile phone, or some other story that's stuck in our head. So we just need to be careful. It's the biggest reason why marriages come apart is a lack of listening. The biggest reason why employees leave organisations, they don't feel their managers listen to them. And unfortunately, on the 30th of December 2019, Dr. Li, an ophthalmologist in Wuhan, China, sent a message to 6 of his colleagues saying, "There's this virus that I'm really worried about. It has a really big impact on older people, and just be safe." And the Chinese authorities intercepted this WeChat and told Dr. Li that, he had to recount what he said and everything was false, and he was ignored. He wasn't listened to, and we lost 3 weeks in the fight around the coronavirus. And unfortunately, on the 22nd of February 2020, Dr. Li lost his life while trying to save patients in the Wuhan hospital as well. So, sometimes it's your marriage and sometimes it's a global pandemic. It's a lack of listening shows up in so many places, Joe.
And I think what's telling, using that example, is how catastrophic it can be when taken to the extreme of something like a pandemic, where it is a matter of life and death. As we know now in hindsight, thousands of people who have lost their lives, not necessarily as a direct result, but we know preventative measures that could have been put into place. In terms of, you used the example of a husband and wife there. I know what comes up quite often in terms of the conversations I have with men in particular is the timing of conversations, because sometimes it can be that a guy is getting ready to go to work in the morning and he's rushing around grabbing his coffee, grabbing maybe his gym bag or grabbing whatever, and his wife is trying to have a conversation with him as he's leaving, which is not always the best time to have a conversation with him. Or conversely, he could be trying to have a conversation with her while she's doing some work stuff on the computer or whatever. And that is something which comes up kind of quite a lot in terms of the dynamic between men and women in intimate relationships, that picking the right time of the day to actually have a conversation where you can both listen with intent and be aware of how you're listening. What suggestions or observations would you have around that subject, Oscar?
Yeah, listening is situational, it's relational, it's contextual, so it varies by conversation. We also need to know that the right conversation at the wrong time is still the wrong conversation. It's unlikely to be successful. So one of the things we don't spend enough time asking each other is a lot of how questions, about how we have the conversation. is now the right time for this discussion? Make the implicit explicit in that case where the man's going out the door with the bag and the woman wants to have the conversation. Well, the man should just stop and go, okay, turn around, face the person, don't shout across the room, step a bit closer and ask what it's about. So rather than having a really broken discussion as one person's walking out the door with their attention somewhere else, of course, and I sense some kind of frustration coming from the other person, just the fact that you come together and face each other and say, when I get home tonight, I'd love to have this conversation. Is that a good time for you? We'll circuit break any tension in that conversation. Or conversely, they might say, no, we need to have the conversation now. But know what the conversation is the first point. Have a discussion about the discussion rather than discussing what you're going to discuss. Hey, I'll be home at 4:30 this evening. Can we have this conversation while we walk around the block? Can we have this conversation over the dinner table? Can we have this conversation after dinner? Can I call you from the while I'm going to work? There are many opportunities to discuss how to have an effective conversation, but most of us don't have that discussion. We just get straight into the content. I've asked you every week, Joe, to put out the trash, again, and your shoes are always in the hallway. Can you put your shoes on the rack? Those kind of conversations. These are the nitty-gritty of relationships, and if we don't pay attention to the little things, the big things never get discussed. And there's two things to be aware of in the dynamic between a male-orientated discussion and a female-orientated discussion. Men listen to fix, women listen to feel. So what you need to be conscious of is ask the person what they want from the conversation. If people just want to vent, they don't want a solution. I have this conversation with my wife, Jen, quite regularly, where we'll be walking the dog and she'll just go, oh, I can't believe what happened today. And I go, great. While we're walking, what do you want from me in this conversation? She goes, I just want to vomit. And I go, great, no problem. So I will listen, but I won't try and solve it. Or, what do you want from this conversation? How do we trade off A versus B? How do we do this in the time frame? Have you got any ideas? And the trick is not to try and answer it consistently during the conversation, let them get it out. And the second part is, Joe, men prefer conversations where they're either doing something with their hands or their eye gaze is looking forward. So men have great conversations on bikes. Men have great conversations walking or running together where they're not actually facing each other. But the irony is the opposite is true for women. They need an intimate conversation where you're looking at each other in the eyes because they feel like you're listening to them more. So you need to just flex a bit in that conversation. So back to your question, just ask about how this conversation is going to happen. And all of a sudden, the tension in the conversation will evaporate quite quickly.
Yeah, and it sounds like from what you're saying is that you need to seek clarification also as to what it is that they want to say before you make a judgment call as to whether you deal with it now, whether you deal with it later. And that's given me a really good insight while you've been talking, because sometimes when my wife has finished her job and she's picking up the children from school after school club, she'll ring me when she's on the way to pick up the children from after school club when coincidentally I'm on my way back from work and I've got like 40 minutes in the car, so I can speak to her with my full attention for quite a period of time in the car. And it's interesting sometimes how just by, I don't know whether it just works out that way, that often when you're in a hurry, once you're actually in the car, you've got more time to have that conversation and actually listen. And actually, bizarrely, sometimes in the car, you're actually listening better than you possibly would be if you were distracted by other stuff. It sometimes works out as kind of quite a good way to have a conversation.
Yeah, and again, in that dynamic, if you're in the car driving as a man, you're going to be looking forward, you're not going to be looking across. And there is something that's meditative about the process of driving, where you are focusing your attention on just the auditory channel, what are they saying, and the road ahead. Whether you're a passenger or a driver, it makes no difference in this context. And a lot of couples will talk about the fact that the highest quality conversations or the biggest arguments they have are in a car, because they've got time alone to kind of go a little bit deeper in the conversation there as well. I think the other thing, Joe, is to think about the role of parents for listening, and as it relates to parents helping their children to learn how to listen, and how parents can be great role models when it comes to listening as well. I think not enough parents get their eyes down to the child's eye level when they're having a conversation. And a lot of time parents will scream over the top of a child's head and go, aren't you listening to me? And in a lot of cases, they may not have actually heard what you said because you're completely barking over the top of the child. And the same is true if you're calling them or FaceTiming them, is get down to their eye level, kneel down, squat down, sit down. Or if you're in the same room as them, you might have to lift them up and put them on a bench, and it'll completely change the way you listen to them. And more importantly, it'll completely change the way the child listens to you as well.
Yeah. Mine are a bit older now. They're 7 and 10, and so they're not toddlers anymore. And I remember one of the first things you learn when they're kind of toddlers is to get down to their eye level, to talk to them on their level, so that they can actually hear what you're saying and they've got your full attention and stuff. Mine are kind of a bit older. Well, they're a bit older now. My eldest one, she kind of is a bit, when she's kind of transfixed and in the zone watching TV, she's kind of, you have to sort of ask her more than once, which bears out exactly what you're saying. But then having said that, if we're walking in the woods together and, they're climbing trees and stuff and that, they're a lot more communicative and engaged with what we're saying and stuff and that. So it is interesting.
And so are you, right?
Yeah.
You're in a different place there in the woods. And again, in that TV conversation, Joe, is now the right time for the conversation with your daughter, or can it wait till the show's concluded? And if not, maybe you just need to grab the remote, press pause, and signal that you're going to, and have the chat then face to face. But a lot of us just don't have that conversation. We'll repeat instructions multiple times and wonder why people aren't paying attention.
Yeah. And I wonder whether that kind of pattern is something that's modelled to us perhaps by our parents or our peer group, where we've seen it, we're modelling behaviour we've seen before. And part of this whole concept of deep listening is trying to kind of unravel, or certainly kind of break the chain of what you've learned from your parents and what they learned from their parents, and kind of break that chain of actually changing the way you look at listening from a completely different viewpoint to everything you've ever known.
Yeah, but parents are the ultimate listening teachers. And, I always joke when I speak in a public forum, it's like, put your hands up if you can remember your listening teacher from school. Everyone will remember their maths teacher or their English teacher or their science teacher, but they won't remember their listening teacher. And I'll explain, your first listening teacher is your parent that says, why did you do that? Or, how many times do I need to tell you? Why aren't you listening? And none of us are taught that. So, one of the things I'm trying to do is help people with some very simple frameworks about eye contact and those kinds of things. I think the other thing that you need to keep in mind too is that you can be a great role model in a positive way too. I ask the opposite question. I say to a group of people, think about the teacher that made the biggest impact on your life at school, whether that's in junior school or high school. And you're probably thinking of them right now, right, Joe?
Yeah, they were the people that listened to me and made me feel like I was the only person in the room at that particular point.
Yeah, and a lot of people take it a little bit further. They go, they not only listened to me, they saw my potential. They saw what I could become. So they were listening a little bit deeper. And people remember that experience decades and decades and decades later. So, the curiosity for me always is if a teacher can make you feel that way and have an impact for decades later for you, it only takes a moment, an extra moment to pause for that teacher to notice you, to give attention to you, and yet the impact lasts for decades. And we don't think about that in that moment where you were just talking about, your daughter not paying attention because she wanted to watch the TV show. Just a little bit longer, a bit of thought that could change your daughter's life forever. And yet we don't think about it because listening isn't speaking. So because we're not creating words, we think it isn't as important. I think the other thing too, when you think about listening, a lot of people get fixated on listening to make sense, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's handy. But the power in deep listening is, I always say, it's not your job as a listener to make sense of what the speaker's saying. And a lot of people are freaking out right now going, what mumbo jumbo is this guy going on about? If you understand the 125-900 rule, so that's not the 125-400 rule, which is the rule of listening. This is the rule of thinking. So I speak at 125 words a minute, but I can think at 900 words a minute. So when I speak on a topic, the likelihood the first thing out of my mouth is what I mean, it's a 1 in 9 chance, or 11%, that what I say is what I mean. And most of us listen to a conversation with a chance of it being right 11% of the time in every conversation. And if we help the speaker make sense of what they're saying, help them understand what they mean, it's quite often not the first thing they say is what they actually want to say. Now, I'm not sure, Joe. Think about a time where somebody went, you've just waited a little bit longer in the conversation, and all of a sudden they catch themselves mid-sentence, and usually it's preceded by them taking a sigh, and they'll go, well, actually, now that I think about it a little longer, what I need to tell you is, or they take a sigh and they go, now that I think about it, the most important thing we need to discuss is, and all that's happening is you're giving them time to make sense of what they mean. The next 125 words, the next 125 words. So for a lot of us, particularly in the West, Joe, we use these phrases around silence called the awkward silence, the pregnant pause, the deafening silence. We have this weird relationship with silence, and yet silence will help that person just think a little bit longer about what they actually mean. So that's when listening becomes really light, really joyful, really helpful, because your attention is on them, not on you, and how am I making sense of what they're saying. Now, of course, you can't ignore what they're saying. You can't drift away. But if you simply just use silence a little bit, you'll be shocked how that person will say to you afterwards, wow, thanks for listening to me, Joe.
And with the silence, it's interesting you say it, because it's used as a lever. I've seen it used as a lever in like a sales technique where you kind of silent close someone and use the power of silence to close someone. But I like the fact that you've mentioned that you're using it to help somebody's brain catch up with what is coming out of their what is coming out of their mouth, rather than a slightly more nefarious purpose that you're using it for in like a sales environment or another environment where you are looking to kind of manipulate a person or use psychological techniques. This is actually to benefit the whole conversation rather than actually to extract something from the person.
Yeah. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that technique you're referencing?
So, in sales, you would learn the silent close. So basically, it's used in negotiation quite a lot. So for instance, if you're selling houses, you would say, okay, the house is on for 200. the buyer has looked around and they want to offer 180, and you know that the sellers are only going to take 198 or something like that. So you say, okay, so they've cut their initial offer is 180. So you're saying, look, I think that the seller is looking for something a little bit closer to the asking price, and so the buyer says, okay, what do you think? What sort of figure do you think that they're looking for? And you say, okay, I think they've had quite a lot of interest in this property at the moment. I think they're looking for something definitely closer to the asking price. And then you just go like that. You almost sit on your. We used to kind of, because we used to work in house sales for a while. You kind of almost put your hand over your mouth like that to stop yourself from saying something. And the urge from the other person is they just want to fill that silence. So they're going to come back with kind of, usually it's used as a technique when you're getting closer up to the asking price, and they'll just fill that silence with, okay, I really don't want to lose it. I'll offer the asking price, or 195 or something like that. But but for most people, the power of that silence is they just don't know what to, they just don't know how to handle it, and their instant reaction is just to fill that silence with something, and all those emotions are going around in their head, like you're saying about your thoughts running faster than what you can speak.
Yeah,
that combines together, and all of a sudden they come up with a higher figure, and it's a more of a kind of nefarious and manipulative way of kind of negotiation. And it's not just used in house sales. I'm sure it's not. It's used I would imagine, in kind of quite a lot of negotiations. I've seen it done in a commercial setting with a buyer and a seller as well, where a professional procurement person is looking to kind of knock down a supplier on their price or whatever, and they use that same technique. But what's kind of quite interesting is when there's two people that know how to use that silent close, and one is using silence as a weapon against the other, and the other is using silence as well. What ends up happening is there's these really deafening, really awkward, long silences.
You kind of get to a stalemate by the sounds of it. Yeah. I'm glad you talked about home sales, because you reminded me of a story where I was working with a person who was selling houses. He'd read the book, he'd reached out to me, he'd done the deep listening quiz and figured out what his listening villain was, and he said, can I spend just half an hour with you on the phone? I want to understand how I could improve my listening in the first contact, the very first time. He typically meets couples, and his go-to question is, Cliff is the client, and his go-to question was, what brings you here today? He's in a display home, so he's not a real estate agent. He's kind of selling construction and things like that. So I'm not sure, Joe, if you was just selling houses or construction in the example you used. And he said he was taught that question by a seller. He said, I thought he was successful, and he was frustrated. He was asking me, is that question useful? And I said, well, it depends what you're trying to achieve. And we brainstormed, and we came up with a really simple alternative question. And the alternative question was, when was the first time you guys had a discussion about building a home? And he started practicing this question. He was quite shocked because, hey, what brings you here today? We're looking for a home. It's kind of pretty obvious what brings him here today. And he asked this question. He was shocked. So typically people move in and out of this display home in 5 minutes. And he got into trouble from his sales manager because people weren't answering, when was the first time did you started discussing constructing a home, was taking up to 15 minutes for them to answer. Now, as a seller, you're probably nodding, smiling there, Joe, going, well, there's going to be a lot of really useful information I can gather. And he said, oh, wow, Oscar, that's a really powerful question. And I said, yeah, but the question's not for you, Cliff. Huh? He went, what do you mean? I said, the question is for them. Your job is to be helpful for them to figure out, have they actually had the conversation? Because in most cases, they might have just driven past and gone, hey, let's pop in and see this home, or whatever the case is. And what he realized in asking this question was twofold. He said in half the cases, the couple hadn't really had a conversation about it, and they were having a conversation in front of him. And in the other half of the conversation, they started going, oh, we really need to think more about how many rooms, or we really need to start to think more about the block of land we already have. And all of a sudden, and he said, I literally said nothing, and they would always say to me, you've been the most helpful salesperson we've seen all week. And what he realized was the number of people he dealt with reduced by a third, and yet the number of sales he made doubled because they thought he was helpful.
Yeah.
And all he was doing was facilitating a conversation and helping them listen to each other, even though he got to be a fly on the wall in that conversation. And I think for a lot of people, they don't kind of realize that it's always how can we help the speaker think about it. And in that case, the speakers were the couple in that. So a really simply constructed question to help the listener make sense of what they're saying. I guarantee you, Joe, they'll always say you're an amazing listener, and all you're doing is letting them think out aloud.
And that can be, as I guess, as simple, Oscar, as asking some slightly more probing questions like, well, what do you mean by that, and how is it that you've come to that conclusion? And again, coming back to that word we used earlier on, which was clarity, when we're talking about seeking clarity in terms of the husband and wife discussion, it's kind of seeking clarity in what people kind of mean and what they actually are saying, and allowing that thought process to catch up with their words, and maybe kind of prompting a different angle that they'd not even thought about, but allowing them the space to process what they are going through in their head properly.
And thinking about those two phrases that you just used, what do you mean by that, or tell me more, I think one is going to be more productive. What do you mean by that? Feels like you're not sure what they mean by that. It feels like it's a question about you. I know your intention is it's about them and helping them think. But there's kind of three phrases that will be really helpful in that context to unpick their listening. And what else? That simple phrase, and what else? Tell me more. And the last one is simply just say the word and. The fourth one we've kind of spent a lot of time on, which is silence. You know, just pausing and allowing them to catch up. But what does this mean? Kind of implies that how they've explained it so far isn't effective. So a lot of people hear that question as a judgmental question. Well, what do you mean? I was like, didn't I explain myself properly? Who are you to judge what I've just said? You know, what does this mean for you? It's a completely different intention in that question, and it's heard completely differently. What does this mean for you going forward? Again, a very different kind of question. What does this mean for you and your family? What does this mean for you and your weekend? What does this mean for you and your children? Again, very similar questions, but it will help them think about it in a very different way. And for a lot of us as speakers, we're trying to make sense of it, yeah? We're trying to make sense of it because we want to solve the problem. And in a lot of cases, people don't want to be fixed. They just want to be heard.
Okay. So you're giving them the permission to be heard and the permission to go deeper in articulating their thought rather than
to themselves.
To themselves, yeah, rather than actually kind of trying to use these different techniques to kind of get clarity. You're actually giving them the space to find their own clarity themselves, and and more importantly, the time to find it.
And if you help them come to their own conclusion by themselves, seriously, they think you're amazing. You've done nothing but create a space and a time for them to explore it. And I remember Cliff saying, he said, Oscar, I cannot believe that they're having this conversation in front of me. Like, I'm a total stranger, and they're talking about their emotional fears and their emotional hopes for their family, and their, some people are talking about when they have kids, or how their parents are going to move into the home with them, because in their traditions they have 3 families in the home and stuff like that. He says people would never tell me that if I asked them, but if I just simply ask them the question, when did you first have this conversation? When did you first think about buying the home? All of a sudden, a whole bunch of additional information comes to life, and it's quite amazing. So that means your orientation is to be helpful to them, not to be helpful to you.
Yeah, and in that context of what you just described there as well, there's a couple of byproducts that I would see as a salesperson that are useful. A, you're qualifying their suitability as a buyer, and B, you're finding out what their possible objections would be to proceeding forward in advance. So you can work out whether or not they're a serious buyer, and whether they are actually serious about buying a house, and also you're pre-noting, if you like, what any objections could be, such as, okay, well, we'd always wanted a house near a forest, for example, or we'd always wanted to be near water, or we'd always it's important for us to be near a specific place of worship or whatever and stuff. And then already in your head, okay, well, I know this development is just near a lake, I know there's some green space nearby, and I know there's a church just down the road. So all of a sudden, as they're having that discussion, you are able to tailor make your response to kind of their objections at the same time. So it's a kind of triple whammy, if you like, in terms of everyone being a winner.
And you've role modeled beautifully the shrewd listener, where you really weren't listening to what they were saying. You were trying to get in a problem-solving mode and jumping ahead in all that anticipation. And I'm not there to kind of make you wrong in how you were thinking about that, because you were trying to be helpful. But again, while you were thinking about and anticipating all those things, you weren't actually listening to their conversation. So I think, yes, of course, that's going to be a byproduct, no problem. But our willingness to solve, to fix, is coming from a helpful place, of course. It's trying to be helpful to them to get a great match and all of that. But just be with them in that moment to help them know somebody's giving them attention will completely transform the relationship in that sense. So for a lot of us, whether we want to interrupt, again, it's coming from a helpful place because we want to help solve. But in a lot of cases, when people are dealing with a complex thing, people probably would construct a home once or twice in their life on average. It's huge. It's huge. And the seller does it every day. These people do it once in a lifetime. And the question I pose to Cliff is, how could you give them a piece of paper with 20 questions they need to ask themselves before they make a buying decision? And he did. He just simply, in 2 days, he kind of typed it up and started sharing it with the potential buyers. And he said, look, here's 20 questions to think about. If you want to come back, I can help you with these 20 questions. Now, he said his sales productivity doubled in a very short space of time because he wasn't having a lot. He wasn't having a lot more conversations. He was having many fewer conversations with people who were ready then to buy, but also people would come back to him years later and reference that conversation. Remember, well, we went away and had that conversation. We realized our finances wasn't lined up They are now. Can you help us with the next step? And he said, look, it's obviously not just that question that he and I constructed together in that moment, but he obviously, he's been in sales for 20 years and he was just looking to fine tune things, but he was a bit shocked. He said because it was easier. He just realized in the old days when buyers were, or potential buyers were coming into the display home, he'd keep saying to people, I'll come straight back to you, but I have to go over here and welcome another person and welcome another person. And now he just relaxed and said, all I have to be is in this conversation because I have a third less conversations now. And those people who are looking in to come in and get a brochure for ideas, that's fine. They can get a brochure and off they go. And I think that's true for all of us in all aspects of our lives. Is like, are we available in that moment for that conversation? Because, you know, that conversation in that moment of time is the most important thing for them. And it could be for you too.
Yeah. And we spoke about being conscious and unconscious, the different things that we do consciously and unconsciously a bit earlier on in the conversation today. And I was just wondering what things that you can do consciously as you are preparing for a conversation in terms of bringing your full listening ears, if you like, to the conversation rather than kind of just turning up kind of off the cuff and trying to wing it, so to speak.
I think a lot of us have lots of browser tabs open in our head when we come into our conversation. You know, we might have 6, 8, 9 simultaneous conversations going on. So depending on the physical situation of the conversation, if you're going to meet them face to face, you know, for me in an office setting as an example, when I cross the lobby going into a building, that's a signal for me straight away to put my mobile phone in my bag off. When I get into the lift or the elevator, I put my back against it. If there's nobody in the elevator, I'll close my eyes and take 3 deep breaths. And all I ask myself when my eyes are closed is simply, what's my intention for this conversation? And it's a question I pose myself to go, is my orientation on me or is my orientation on them? So a simple example, I really want to make the sale, that's my intention. Or I really want to be helpful to them and see if I can solve their problem today. And the way I might solve the problem is with me, or I might refer them to somebody else. So I think if you're picking up the phone to call someone, just take 30 seconds before that, close your eyes and take 3 deep breaths. Make sure your feet are on the ground. And if you can't close your eyes, just take 3 deep breaths before you pick up the phone and make the call. Now, don't do that if you're driving in a car. That's not a good idea. I was doing an online facilitation, Joe, about 4 weeks ago. And it was a 2-hour session, and we co-created an amazing outcome. But as a facilitator, I had 2 screens going. I had breakout rooms. I had poll slides. I had electronic sticky notes. I had a webcam in front of me. I had their webcams. I had microphones. There was a whole box and dice going on. So when I hung up and concluded the conference, my head was exploding. But the opposite is true. I knew that was going to happen, and I left a half an hour gap in my schedule so I could be productive for the next call. The next call was a half an hour call where somebody was dealing with a very complex issue around what's a framework they can deal with in an ethical way to stand down staff at the moment. You know, that's a tough decision for them to make, and they needed somebody to talk it through with. Now, if I would have gone straight from the facilitation back to back into that conversation, I wouldn't be productive for the first 10 to 15 minutes because my brain was fried. My attention was completely in a space that was outside of that conversation. So sometimes it's just leaving enough space, Joe, in between the conversations. And it doesn't have to be half an hour. One of the things I do with my clients, and they've figured out my trick now. So if I book a call with them, I'll always call them at 5 minutes past the hour. And in the olden days, they used to go, oh, I'm so grateful you gave me that little bit of space because I've been going back to back all day and da 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 da. And what I did was, okay, so I'm hearing these people always saying, I'm going back to back into meetings. So what can I do to be helpful? I know I'll book a meeting for half an hour, but I'll only call them at 5 past the hour. And all of them they come into the conversation in a completely different space. Now, what do I do? From the top of the hour to the 5 minutes, I just close my eyes and go, what's going to be productive for them, which does make me more productive for them. So just getting ready for the conversation, I reckon that's 90% of the success in listening. But most of us think it's in the dialogue itself. If we've got all those browser tabs open, the mind, the working memory, the part of memory that's used for listening, it's got a finite capacity, Joe. So give it a chance. Close down those browser tabs so you can come into the conversation in an impactful way.
And allow a little bit of space. I like that way. The way you describe kind of bookending one bit before you move on to the next bit. Is there any value in visualizing how your conversation is going to go, Oscar? Because I know that is a technique that a lot of people use in terms of performing at their best. Is there any value to visualizing the conversation, or can you just kind of see how it goes when you shut your eyes and relax?
Yeah, for me, there's no intention of progress or process. For me, visualizing a conversation feels arrogant. It feels self-centered. Because listening is a simultaneous equation between two or more people, who are you to judge what the outcome could be?
Yeah.
For me, I'm very comfortable with the duality of not knowing what's on a call. And particularly, it's interesting, podcast interviews are a really interesting example of listening by the host. And I get some hosts who go, well, our interview format is this, and it's 26 minutes long, and at the 15-minute mark, I have to read something, and these are the 3 questions I'm always going to ask you. And it's like, oh, yeah, no problem. And then there's other hosts that go, hey, we're just going to have a chat, and I'm going to listen to you. And they genuinely do. They just listen to as if you're having a chat in a coffee shop. And my sense is that neither's right or wrong. Like, the person who's got the structure, that's helpful for them and their audience. So it's not my job to go, oh, that's bad, and I'm judging it. It's like, that's good for them. So how can I help that? If I was to visualize my ideal interview, it would probably go for 5 hours. We'd go really deep into the neuroscience of listening. Then we'd jump across to the neuroscience of distractions, and that would take the first 2 hours. Who's that helpful for? Absolutely nobody except me and my self-serving excitement around listening, as opposed to the host is hosting an interview on behalf of their audience, and they know what their audience want to hear. And more importantly, they know what their audience don't want to hear. So I think if you visualize the conversation playing out, Joe, just notice where are you visualizing progress for both parties, or you're just visualizing progress for yourself. I think that will be good noticing in that example.
Yeah, and I've got a really strong insight from what you've just said, actually, because there is, I think, the kind of theme, if you like, of what we've been talking about tonight is really how we allow conversations to become a little bit kind of more organic and kind of cede control of it actually being a projection of what you want before you actually enter into the conversation. And that's the kind of bit that I've really taken away from our conversation today, is that in actual fact, to have those better conversations, and listen properly, you do need to kind of release those expectations and the control element of it, and just allow it to organically develop in the way it's going to develop. Because I think there's a great deal of value in that, because so much of what we are obsessed with in the modern world is control. You know, we want to be able to have things when we want them, and we want to do things when we want them, and we want conversations to go in a kind of certain way. And there is this kind of inherent disappointment that if something doesn't go the way it's meant to go, that we've kind of lost control of the situation and whatever. And it sounds like, from what you've been describing, to really allow these conversations to flourish and really allow listening to happen, you've got to cede a little bit of control, if not a lot of control, in order to get to that point where the listener feels comfortable enough to go real deep in what they're going to tell you.
And I think control and organic are interesting kind of parts on a continuum. What I aim for is co-constructed. Can we co-construct a great outcome together? And it simply sounds like, and I often say this in the first meeting with someone, what would make a great meeting for you? And off they go. A great meeting would make blah, 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 blah. And okay, so if we're to prioritize those, blah, 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 blah. Now, in, I would say, 90% of cases, Joe, they never ask me the alternate question, what would make a great conversation for me? But that doesn't mean I cede control. That doesn't mean I let it go completely organic. In that moment, I also go, hey, you know, for me, a great conversation would kind of sound like this. And if we're drawing it as two circles, we'd kind of overlap here. Where should we go first? That conversation is very deliberate. It's very co-constructed. So it's not like it's organic, it goes off in all kinds of directions. That's not bad, by the way. Nor is it controlled, where I've got my agenda, you've got your agenda. I think co-constructing a conversation, that simultaneous equation we talked about earlier on, is something that we're not conscious about doing. We have a conversation, as I said earlier on, with 11% of the content. You know, they go, well, I would like A, B, and C in this conversation today. And most people will stop there. That's 11%. Whereas they'll go A, B, and C. And I'll say, you know, that's great. Is there anything else now that you've mentioned A, B, and C that we should be discussing? And always, Joe, always they'll go, oh yeah, I've forgotten about finances perspective on this. Or they'll say, oh yeah, we haven't taken into account the seating arrangements at the wedding, or whatever the conversation is. So co-constructed becomes a really powerful and productive way for the dialogue to emerge, because we're making the implicit explicit, which we don't do a lot. We kind of have all these hidden kind of conversations where we go, oh, I should have done that. I wish they would have say it. And then it's co-constructed.
Yeah, I can see that there's a subtle difference, isn't there, where you're collaborating in a lot more of I'm looking for the word and it's completely escaping me at the minute, but you're collaborating in a completely different way, so that it is organic, but it's kind of you're still able to help each other get to the point at which you want to get to. Yeah. And the opposite is true too, by the way. If you want to get to become a better learner, get comfortable asking this question. And always ask it with 10% of the meeting time to go. So if it's a 30-minute meeting, ask it at the 27-minute mark or something like that. If it's a 1-hour meeting, ask it at about the 50-minute mark. What was the most productive thing in our conversation so far? Blah, 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 blah. Is there anything else we should have discussed that we haven't? Because you need to leave some time to actually discuss it. And again, in most cases, they'll say, actually, I wish we would have spent, okay, great. Well, we've got 10 minutes. Would you want to continue or go there? Oh, no, let's go there. And off we go. If I'm in a really good relationship with somebody at the 5-minute mark to go on a 1-hour meeting, or at the 3-minute mark on a 30-minute meeting, Joe, I'll always say,
what was the most unproductive thing we explored today? And they'll always say, oh, blah, 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 blah. Okay, great. Thanks for asking that. And what that is teaching me to do is go, what was valuable for them, not what was valuable for me. So then I go, oh, okay, so be careful when I ask that question next time, or that question only works in particular kind of context. And so in that case, again, we're listening to those other 775 words, what's unsaid in their head. And in a lot of conversations, particularly in workplaces, we never ask that question. And worse still, if there's 6 people in a meeting, we only ever hear from 2 or 3 of them. So what's unsaid gets multiplied by the number of people in the room as well.
Yeah.
So I think be deliberate in co-constructing a conversational space that's productive for everybody, not just what you're trying to visualize. I think visualizing is important as long as it's visualizing together, as opposed to, oh, this is my outcome and I'm going to be awesome.
Yeah. And I can see the distinction there. Definitely. Oscar, it's been a privilege speaking to you today. And listeners won't realise this, but this is the second time we've had a go at this conversation, because we had some gremlins the first time round, so we've had to redo this conversation. So I do appreciate your patience in putting this one down again. What is the best place for people to find out about the work that you're doing and the Deep Listening book? I've got a copy of the Deep Listening book here with the card set as well, so which I have got ready and raring to go to start working through in the next 5 weeks.
Joe, if you go and visit listeningquiz.com, you'll be able to take a quick 7-minute quiz to understand what your listening barriers are, what gets in your way. You'll get a personalized report with 3 very specific actions tailored to your listening barriers. But there you can also access the playing cards, the jigsaw puzzle, the book. You can access the research that supports this. You can access the world-class Deep Listening podcast where we interview professional listeners, whether that's suicide counselors or deaf interpreters, foreign language interpreters, judges, journalists, anthropologists. And we were lucky enough to win an award from Apple a couple of years ago for this very narrow podcast. So if you love to listen, it's a really fun place to go and listen. So listeningquiz.com is the gateway to get all that information.
Okay, super, fantastic. And I'm going to ask you one more question, which I ask all of the listeners that come on to Guild of Dads, because the 3 pillars of Guild of Dads are vision, action and meaning. What is the thing that gives you the most meaning in life, Oscar?
I'm on this quest to create 100 million deep listeners in the world, and for me it's helping people notice the productive conversations that they want to have, that they need to have, that they love to have. But honestly, yesterday I had 2 of my grandkids over and we were playing with Lego, and that was probably more meaningful than 100 million deep listeners in the world, Joe, to be honest, just to watch their curiosity and their awe as we built a little tower together, and understanding how to fit snap pieces in and watch them not worry about color or not worrying about geometry in the Lego pieces. And the Paige and Xander teach me a lot about my curiosity barriers. So that's what gives me meaning.
So you're going to teach them about listening and they're going to teach you about curiosity. I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
And the two aren't very far from each other.
No, exactly. Go hand in hand, I think, based on our conversation this evening, definitely. It's been a real pleasure having you come on to speak to me, Oscar, this evening, and I want to thank you very much. I appreciate you getting involved with what we're doing here, and I wish you all the very best, sir.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, Oscar.